Hey everybody, today's video I wanted to talk a little bit about spiritualism and some of the history of spiritualism. I talked a little bit about this in a video that I did a couple years ago. Actually, it was the first time that I visited Lilydale. I talked a little bit about spiritualism and well, for the most part, the information was correct. There were some inaccuracies in there, and over the years, as I've learned more and have grown more, I've just found it really interesting. To me, as a medium and a spiritualist, I find the history really fascinating, and I think it's important to honor the history and where we came from and how it kind of paved the way for people working in this field to do the work that we're doing today. So, I guess first I want to start by kind of defining some terms, because a lot of people use spiritualist very loosely. So most people, when they use the word spiritualist, they kind of mean it in the sense of spiritualist with a lowercase s, meaning of a spiritual or a mystical nature or practice. But when I use the term spiritualism, I'm referring to spiritualism with a capital S, which is modern spiritualism, which was sort of birthed on or around 1848. So if you ask most people, most spiritualists, about the birth of spiritualism, they'll probably all tell you a very similar story. In 1848, in Hydesville, New York, there were two young girls who lived with their mother and father in a small cabin, a small cottage, Kate and Maggie, and their parents were John and Margaret Fox. And I believe it was March 31st on 1848 that strange rapping noises started happening in their home. And over time, those rappings developed into a system of communication to where a rap may indicate yes, an absence of a rap may indicate no, or the spirit communicator or the source of these rappings would spell out messages rapping through the letters of the alphabet. And people from far and wide came to see the phenomena in this house. Now, depending on who you talk to, you'll get mixed stories about whether or not this was legitimate or if this was a hoax, an elaborate hoax developed by these young girls, who many say caused the rappings themselves by popping their joints. Other people have said that there was an apple tied to a string that was used to make the rappings, but the interesting thing about that is, as people from far and wide came to witness this phenomena, the rappings were able to give correct answers and information about things that the young girls would have no way of knowing about themselves. And also, as this phenomena took place, the oldest of the Fox sisters, Leah Fish, or Leah Underhill Fish, who was much older than Kate and Maggie, the two young girls went to live with her for a while to kind of escape the attention, and the rappings followed them to Rochester and eventually became known as the Rochester rappings. Now, a lot of people say that Leah saw this as an opportunity to capitalize upon this phenomena, whether it be legitimate or a hoax, and make money. And eventually, in time, allegedly her mediumship developed herself. So a firestorm kind of took place, and these young girls, these young women who are essentially nobodies, who came from a very simple family, kind of isolated in rural New York, became sort of these overnight national celebrities. And what happened is it sparked an amazing interest and intrigue in the spirit world, and before you know it, circles and seances and mediums started popping up all over the place as people started sitting for mediumship themselves in their home and conducting their own seances and things like that, discovering their own latent mediumship ability. Now, What happened after that is actually quite sad. So for these girls who are essentially like America's sweethearts, they had not so great lives. And part of it was probably due to the fame and the notoriety. Um, all of the sisters had failed marriages. All of the sisters at one point had suffered with alcoholism, and their relationships with each other suffered as a result of this development of mediumship that took place for them. You know, I believe it was Kate who moved to England and was demonstrating there. She was widowed. I think Maggie was widowed as well. And for a while, as they were traveling and touring and demonstrating, they were subjected to a lot of really harsh scrutiny and testing. Much of it turned out to be inconclusive, but as their star waned, and as the money left, and as they descended in their alcoholism, it kind of caused them to turn on each other. Now, Leah, the oldest sister, being, I guess, maybe having an eye for opportunity, found herself, she married wealthy, found herself in a very comfortable position. And as the younger two sisters found themselves sort of in poverty and on very hard times, she sort of turned their back on them. And many believe that this is what caused them to recant their claims as legitimate. I believe it was Maggie, I could be mistaken there, but it was either Kate or Maggie made an official statement to a newspaper in New York that the whole thing was fraudulent. And some people say that that's the truth. Other people say that it was their way of getting back at Leah for turning their back on them, her back on Kate and Maggie. And even though they both sort of took back that statement, it delivered a death blow to spiritualism, the movement of spiritualism with a capital S, modern spiritualism, that still has an effect today, which is probably why it's not very prominent, at least not here in the United States. But spiritualist practices definitely predate 1848. Obviously, as I said, spiritualism with a lowercase s. There's always been seers and mediums and oracles and diviners. But there were some forefathers or forerunners that sort of set the stage for this phenomena of modern spiritualism. One of the primary ones is Andrew Jackson Davis, who is known as the forefather of spiritualism. Andrew Jackson Davis, known as the Poughkeepsie Seer, is from New York. And he was very much influenced by the works of Emanuel Swedenborg and Anton Mesmer, which modern hypnosis kind of stems from, mesmerism. And it was through his pursuits of learning about mesmerism and some of the Swedenborgian philosophy that he found he could enter trance state and could perform clairvoyant feats and diagnose illness and even conduct healings, not unlike, who would come almost 100 years later, Edgar Cayce, the famous sleeping prophet. So, there were those who sort of set the stage. Also, the Shakers, who were an off-branch of the Quakers, very much were linked with the spiritualists of the time, and even a lot of the spiritualist camps like Lilydale that were born were, kind of started as these meeting places or these summer camps where, Shakers and free thinkers of the time, people who promoted free love and sort of these utopian mindsets of society all kind of gathered together, and at that time of modern spiritualism, it all kind of blended and had an influence on what modern spiritualism was to become. So, modern spiritualism is a religion, a science, a philosophy, a way of life whose primary basis is that life continues after physical death, and through mediumship, we can demonstrate and prove with evidence that physical death is not the end. There are no dead, there is no death. And that we also comply to natural law. Depending on what organization you associate with or explore, you may see 7 tenets or 9 tenets, but primarily, we live by the golden rule, we follow natural law, and we practice communication with those on the spirit side of life who are not dead, they just no longer have a physical body. And it's interesting how spiritualism flourished, or why it flourished. So, at the time, this Victorian era, this is a time in history that was kind of steeped in death. And it was a time of social and political reform, and it makes sense that spiritualism fit very well in with the movements of the time. The Victorian era had a lot of illness, plagues and cholera and tuberculosis, and the average lifespan was not elderly by any means. So a lot of people were dying very young, and people were seeking a connection. There was a lot of, as I said, religious reform, where there was breaking away from the Catholic Church and the stronger footholds of Protestant religions. People didn't want to accept the idea of like pre-birth, stillbirths or miscarriages, not entering into heaven, things of that nature. So a religion like spiritualism was able to say that these souls aren't damned, and prove this through message work or spirit communication. The other thing too is there's war, and spiritualism has often thrived during wartime because people are seeking to tend to their grief by knowing that their loved ones really aren't dead, or that they're in a better place. Spiritualism is interesting because it started very much at the forefront of progressive, leading edge thought. I mentioned that oftentimes some of these free thinkers that were associated with spiritualists and spiritualism often were believers in free love, and were the early feminists. During the popular era of spiritualism, there were a lot of women's rights issues. There were the suffragettes, and many spiritualists were also the early feminists who were seeking the right to vote, as well as just equality of the sexes in a general, civil context. Victoria Woodhull, the first woman to run for president, was a spiritualist. Her and her sister used to demonstrate or perform in her father's sort of like a traveling show when they were younger, demonstrating, clairvoyance and healing and things of that nature. She was also into free love as well. But spiritualism, I think, has had an interesting shaping upon the world. It's also kind of interesting to note that most spiritualists were also, even for their times, even 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago, 100 years ago, were more accepting of sexuality. And despite the fact that even some spiritualist communities can have Christian leanings, I've always found spiritualist camps and communities to be very LGBT friendly. And a lot of times it's because I think a lot of the mediums are gay, or bisexual, or transgender. So that wasn't a big issue for them, even as long as 100 years ago. Most male mediums are gay. That's just the way that it is. So that's not a thing that's really been a big issue. So spiritualists have started in a way of always being, supportive of women and equality, sex and equality. Interesting, too, to note that some of the other prominent figures in spiritualism, or that were spiritualist, was Harriet Beecher Stowe, who's known for writing Uncle Tom's Cabin. Many believe that book played a role in sparking the Civil War, and as a spiritualist, she believed that those words came from spirit. Abraham Lincoln was not a spiritualist, but was intrigued and fascinated by spiritualism, and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, often regularly held seances in the White House to sort of seek answers after losing her son Willie. And many people believe, too, that through the messages that came through in this seance, that kind of encouraged Lincoln to step forward in abolishing slavery. So it's spiritualism, even though most people don't know it, or many people don't know of it, has had an amazing influence on culture and society, more so than people realize. I mentioned the feminist aspect of it, and it's interesting with spiritualism. In a time, in this Victorian era, where women were seen as second-class citizens, in the spiritualist movement, women held power. Women held positions of power. Just the fact that they supposedly had these otherworldly abilities to connect and communicate with spirit gave them some kind of power that they did not have just as a woman or just as a wife. Two, prominent figures in spiritualism, so we had a lot of the physical mediumship, and then a lot of it went into inspirational work and trance work. Cora L.V. Richmond and Emma Harding Britton were very well known and well regarded, and very young, actually, known as speaking mediums, who either spoke through spirit inspiration or sort of in kind of a form of trance. And in these trance states, or in these inspired lectures, they would deliver information beyond their capacity to understand. They would often speak on the power of science and medicine and philosophy, and rites, and channel these really beautiful, eloquent messages in a time where it was not normal for women to speak publicly, especially in that kind of format. And at the end of these lectures, they would have the chance to answer questions where people would ask them about certain subject matters, and they would inspirationally speak, or speak these insights and these answers that were really profound. And that's the other thing too about spiritualism, is many people today, when they think of spiritualism, think of it as mystical, and then over here as scientific. But from the beginning, spiritualism sought to find truth in science, and did not see spiritualism and science as diametrically opposed. They thought that they could be sort of both coexisting in each other. And that's why many people see spiritualism as the thinking man's religion, because it allows room for change and growth, and it doesn't say that this can't happen. It says that, yes, we believe this, but we also believe that this can be explained when these two worlds kiss, or when these two worlds meet. That what we're doing does not go against natural law, but the laws that govern spirit and the laws that govern the physical are one and the same laws. And it's in this middle ground that the truth resides. So I thought that was really interesting. Another way in which society was actually influenced was through Daniel Douglas Home, or Hume, as he pronounced it, who was probably one of the most phenomenal physical mediums of his time, known as sort of an eccentric and effeminate man. He was known for his many phenomena: manifestation, materialization, apports, transfiguration, partial and full materialization, and most notably his levitations. And he actually had an influence on the Russian Tsar Alexander II to free the serfs through information or messages that came through in his seances. Queen Victoria was very much interested and partook in spiritualist practices. So even in places where you would least expect it, you can find the influence of spiritualism, and I think that it has the potential to be just as great today as it was before. So just a few interesting things I wanted to share with you. I hope that you found it as interesting as I did. Take care, guys.